Hello and welcome to Localizing Reports in Power BI. My name is Markus Ehrenmueller-Jensen and I hope you enjoy my session. Don't forget to explore what PAS has offered to you, and don't forget to submit your feedback because it's important to us speakers. Please visit the session evaluation link in the left-hand side navigation bar to rate this session. My name is Markus Ehrenmueller-Jensen. As mentioned, I'm the founder and a business intelligence architect at Azure Data. You find my contacts here, and I'm sure you will find me if you look out for me. I'm quite active in the community. I'm the co-founder of the Power BI user group in Austria and PAS Austria, and also we're organizing SQL Saturdays in Austria, so the next one will be in 2 months in January 15, and this will be an online virtual event as well, so I hope I see somebody of you at our event as well. So what is Localized Reports? What I mean with Localized Reports, let's see here what we've got here. This is a report published to the Power BI service, and I assume not so many people speak Danish. That's why I picked Danish as a language here to set most people of you into the feeling and the context, and they see the numbers. They can read the numbers like 2 and 1 here, but they lose the context because they cannot understand what those categories mean or what the rest of the text means. So the idea of localizing reports is that I can just click, for example, on English, and then everything will be translated to English. So we have like the page navigation there, we have fixed static text like the headers translated into English, and of course we also have the categories named in blue and red and chair and house translated into English language. Unfortunately, there is no single button to achieve this in Power BI. So what I did, I looked up what the web is offering on solutions and then thought about what I can take from that and make up my own solution. So what I found, for example, is an example leveraging bookmarks. That means that you put like all the elements on the screen, one time in, for example, English, one time in, for example, Danish, and then you use a bookmark to hide the other language and only show the elements in one language. This is a cool concept, but I didn't like it for my solution because this doesn't scale. If you add another language, I have to add another set of report visuals on my report and add another bookmark and then change this around. So this doesn't really scale. Another solution from which I took an idea but made it a little bit different, I squeezed it, is the expression-based titles with measures. So for example, instead of having a static text showing sales or sell is the Danish version of sales, I could create a measure like switch, selected value language en. So selected value language returns whatever the user has selected from the language table. If nothing is selected, then I return en for English. And if this expression selected value language en returns en, I return over switch sales. If not, I return sell. So that means again that if there's another language, I have to change all my measures to add this new language, and this is what I did not like with that solution. Then of course you could also add languages as different columns, so having one single column per language, and this YouTube video linked here does a good job explaining how you can achieve this. But at the end it shows like that you could like switch the language and then see that the texts, the categories in different languages, and I just could not find out how this person made this happen. There's also some comments on the YouTube video, so I don't know how the person did this, so I could not leverage this idea. What I really like is having relationships to the language table, because what I like is to build up a data-driven solution, because I like that people can like add a new language or add a new translation without me changing anything in the report. And relationships help with that, because then we have a language table, we have dimensions, and in this dimension table we have the products, for example, several times. So product with ID 1 is there ones with the English text and another ones with the Danish or German text. And then over the relationship from the language table, the dimension table is then selected. So cool idea, but how it is demonstrated in this video or in this link did only work for me with one single dimension, and usually I have more than one dimension. But again, I took this as an idea and made my own solution out of that, which I will show in a minute. And the last but not least is very interesting one, Power Query parameter. Through Power Query parameter, on the link, the blog and the YouTube video, they show how you can change the column names of your Power Query results dynamically depending on a parameter. I didn't know that this is actually possible. The backdraft with this is that every time you change the language, you have to refresh all the Power Queries, which did not work for my use case. And of course, if you rename the columns, this will break your visuals because the column English is not available anymore because we changed to Danish. Now it's called dansk. So this breaks your reports unless you again use, for example, bookmarks, changing the languages also, as well there. So with that said, I'm not making fun of those things, but I really like their concepts. It just did not work for me. Maybe those solutions work for you. But I came up with my own solution, which is not perfect either. So what I like with my own solution, what I came up with, is that every time I add a new language or a new translation, I do not have to change anything in the report, anything in the model. So we can just deploy the report as it is, and if they decide to add new languages on production, I do not have to touch anything. The backdrafts are that for the report headlines, you have to refresh the Power Query and not only refresh the model, but you have actually open up Power Query either in Power BI or an Analysis Services Tabular, and then refresh manually the model there so we get the new columns for the new static texts for the headlines. I will show in a minute what I mean with that. Then my solution is data driven. It means that we have a rather complex model compared to normally simple use cases, as we will see in the demo, and also more complex stacks. So we have to add something in our measures for all of our dimensions. And if we have a new dimension, then we have to change our measures. So for every new dimension in our model, we have to add something in our measures. And last but not least, if you have pre-selections, so if you store, for example, that you want to see only chairs in your report, so you have a slicer there and save it with chairs. If somebody changes the language, then it still sticks with chairs, but doesn't show anything, because in Danish there is no chairs, it's stol. So chairs is not available, chairs is still selected, and we can see it in the slicer, but no data is available. So after you have changed the language in the selection, then you have also to change the selection on your slicer. So there's a little bit of side effect there. So with that, I internally have two goals. One is that I show you some, maybe new things you can learn about Power BI. And on the other hand, I use as a use case to demonstrate how I implemented my own multi-language reports, my localized reports. So there's two things. Maybe you do not like everything on my solution, but I hope that you still learn something new about Power BI, like having DAX measures and about modeling. So localizing, what does it mean? It does mean that we have on the one hand textual content. That means like the product names, products in English or in other different languages. So we have to change the content of our dimensions, text values in our dimensions according to the selected language. The other thing are the report headlines. There would be static text. So we just type in the text we want to see as a headline, as a title, or as a text for a button. But if we localize the report, then this has to be changed automatically depending on the selected language again. For some use cases, you not only want to change the text, but also want to change the numbers according to currency. So we will have a small look at how you can implement currency exchange rates. That is the model metadata. So if I connect to the model, I might choose that I want to see the model in English or in Danish or in different languages. yeah, we will see there. This is not fully supported in Power BI. The team is apparently working on that. They announced several times that they will work on it, but then they postponed it again because the other features had priorities. And of course, Power BI Desktop and Power BI Service itself as a tool also supports languages, and we will shortly talk about how we can change the languages in Power BI Desktop or at the service. So first, textual content. How can we change the content of our dimensions? For example, the product names should appear in different languages. So first, I have to create a language dimension which contains a distinct list of available languages. Second, I have to add rows per language in every dimension. So like for the product ID number 1, there's not one single row then, but it's several rows per language. So one, it appears as bikes, and in the second, the same key, number 1, also appears in a different language than a different language. In some cases, you might think about a sort order column, because if you change the language, maybe you do not want to change like the bars or the columns the order of the columns or the bars in your visual. To avoid this, you have to assign or come up with a sort order column and then order the text column by the numeric column instead of the alphabetical order. You could earn bonus points here by using Cognitive Services. I will not show Cognitive Services in this first demo, but in the second one. So you can learn to translate things without even knowing the language, without even having someone translating this for you. You can use Cognitive Services for that. For the third in the model, as we add one row per language in the dimensions, like bikes is not only one row but several rows because it has several translations, we end up with a many-to-many relationship between the fact table and the dimension table, because the product number 1 of course appears hopefully several times in the sales table, so we sold it several times, but usually we have only one sales row can be assigned, so just one row in the dimension by a product key, for example number 1. But with my solution I have several rows for product key number 1, because the product key is not the primary key anymore there, but only together with the language. So we have to introduce a bridge table, and I will show this in a minute in the demo. Then we have to set the relationships right. I will walk you through why I chose the relationships like I use them. And this is also very important to do. Then you have to change your measures. So you have to have more complicated measures, because we have to, all the filtering on the language is not done in the model, but in the measures. At least this is what I came up with. Yeah, and pre-saved filters unfortunately do not really work. We have you have this side effect that you have then, after you change the language, you also have to change the already selected filters. Let's see this in our first demo. Let's go over to Power BI. Now let's start with Excel. So, good old friend Excel. I just want to walk you through my data model and the data I actually have there. So first is the fact table. I have a fact ID here. This is not really important. And this fact table is really easy. We have only 2 rows, one with amount 1, the other one with amount 2, and they're referring to different dimensions. So for dimension 1, we have 11 and 12, and dimension 2, 21 and 22. So dimension 1, how is this built up? We can change there to, why did this appear? I do not need you. So dimension number 1. Dimension number 1 is here. And as you can see, 11 and 12, which are referred in our fact table, appears 2 times in the dimension table. So one for the English language, which is house and chair, and another one, the same IDs appear another one for the Danish language as hus and store. The same also happens in dimension 2. So it was 21 and 22 was the ID there referred in the fact table. And once I have these rows as red and blue, and another one for the Danish version as rød and blå. And last but not least, we have the language table which I use to make the user a selection. So I offer the user a selection, and this is done through the language table here. So let's add another language. It happens that I'm Austrian, so I speak also German. which is Deutsch in German. And let's add it here, and let's also add the rows in the dimension tables. So I copy the English one, change it to Deutsch, and red would be rot, blue would be blau. And for the house and the chair, in German, this is Haus und Stuhl, like that. And that's it for my solution. Now we're almost done. So we're going back to our Power BI report, the one you've seen in the slide. So currently there's only a chair, stool, and if I refresh this, we should see, I have to close the Excel file. Let me close it down. So not only save it, but we have to close it, otherwise Power BI cannot access it. Let's see if I was fast enough for the refresh. So now everything is read again from the Excel spreadsheet, our dimensions with the new text and the language table with the new language available. And what happens here is that now we get also Stuhl and Haus here in this, but we have a little bit of an issue because we had only 2 rows in our fact table, one for the chair, one for the house, but now we have 6 rows or 6 things appearing in the column chart. And the reason is because there's no filter in our model. Let's see what the model looks like. So the model looks like this. Let's zoom a little bit into this here. So it's basically a very simple model. So we have a fact table. That's the one referring to the dimensions with 1 and 2 as the amount. And then we have the 2 dimension tables, one with chair and house and the other one with blue and red. But this is a little bit more complicated because we have now not a one-to-many relationship to the fact table, but it's a many-to-many relationship to the fact table, as I already explained, because the dimension ID referred in the fact table is not anymore a primary key in the dimension table. The primary key is a composite key, dimension and language ID. And I do not want to select the language from the fact table, but I want to select the language independently. So to transform this many-to-many relationship in one-to-many relationships, which are faster in our model, I introduced this bridge table. So the bridge table I build not directly in Excel, but I use Power Query to build it. So it's not very hard to build this bridge table. If you take a look on what we are having here, so there's like the dimension 1, and the dimension 1 table is referring to the dimension bridge table is referring to the dimension 1 table. So it's exactly the same thing. As we can see here, there wasn't refresh here, so we still don't see the English text. So there's like those lines with English and 11 and house, and English and 12 and chair, and then the Danish version of that. And in just two steps, I removed all the other columns. So I only have the dimension ID there. And then I just remove the duplicates. This is very easy to do in Power Query, removing duplicates, and then I end up with a distinct list of those IDs. This is my bridge table. That's how I created the bridge table. Not much of a big issue. Now we see that the language table is connected to the text components, which we will talk later on, but the language table does not filter the dimensions. And this is the reason why we see like all the dimensions appearing several times, because the fact table refers a product, the dimension 1, 11, which is chair, stall, and stool in 3 languages. So one way would just one way to solve this would be to grab this language ID and just make up a filter connection here. So we have a filter relationship, and then the language would filter the dimension. And if you take a look, this works. So we only see Stuhl and Haus because Deutsch is selected, and I could change this to English or the other languages to change it back to chair and house. So this is working. This is not completed. As you can see, like the numbers are wrong now because the colors are still not filtered. Dimension 2 is the color dimension. It is still not filtered. So I end up with a value of 6 and 3 for my for my numbers for the chair. And this is completely wrong because we only sold an amount of 2 for chairs and 1 for houses, not 3 and 6. And the reason is because language is not filtering the dimension with containing the colors. So I could also go there and add the language ID over to the dimension. And what we're seeing here is that it's now coming up with a dashed line. And if you previously worked with Power BI, you know that the dashed line means that this is an inactive relationship. So the this checkbox here, make this relationship active, is not checked. And of course we can try to mark it here. So we want an active relationship and not an inactive relationship, but then we get not a warning, but an error message. As you can see, I cannot click on OK. And this error message tells me you can't create a direct active relationship between dimension 2 and language, because that would introduce ambiguity between tables language and fact. To make this relationship active, deactivate or delete one of the relationships between language and fact first. So there's a trouble now between language and fact. Why is that? So let's cancel this and take a look again onto the model. What the message tells me is if this would also be active, an active relationship, Power BI or the model of Power BI does not know if I select one language, if the fact table should be filtered over the path over dimension 1, or it should be filtered over the path over dimension 2. Because we as humans know this makes perfectly sense because we end up with a useful thing, but Power BI says this is an ambiguous model path and I do not allow that. So unfortunately, I have to delete this and we cannot filter over the model. So let's delete both relationships again. And then find a different solution. And maybe you're aware you can always exchange complexity or functionality in the model with complexity or functionality in DAX. So DAX and the model always go hand in hand. And this is what I came up with here. So we have like the the fact, and then we have this sales measure. This is the one we currently see in our report, and this is a rather easy one. It's more or less just the sum over the amounts of my fact table. And because I implemented also a currency conversion, I have one measure showing me the current valid currency exchange rate, and then I just multiply the amount with that. We came to that later, and there's a calculator which is not really necessary in this use case. And this did not work. But what will work is if I change my current visual and put the sales instead. There's a different measure, and as you can see now, chair and house appears, only blue and red appears, and we now have number 2 and number 1 again. So this is perfectly working. If I'm changing languages to German, then will be Stuhl and Haus, blau and rot, or Dansk, again, then we have Stol, Hus, blau, roll. So what's the magic behind this measure? And this measure is, as I promised, a little bit complicated. Looks like a bit overcomplicated for the use case, but it's complicated because we need the measure to do actually the filter on the languages. So the filter is not done in the model, but done in our measure. And you should recognize this is the very same line, fact amount times selected currency exchange rate, to implement the sum of the sum of the amounts, multiplied with the exchange rate. And then we have a calculate here. Here this calculate is necessary because calculate does some things, and one of the features of calculate is that I can pass in filters. So I can add more columns or more parameters to this function calculate, and those are filters. They are filtering my calculation here. How is this filtering done? So underscore dim1 is not really a filter, but that's a reference to a variable I defined here. So this variable again then uses treat as. So when I first saw this name, I wasn't sure, is it like Triatas, a Greek goddess, but it's treat as. So we're treating the dimension 1 language ID as if it would be the same like this variable language ID. So again, a variable in here. So we give one step above. We can see how this variable language ID is calculated, and this is calculated as selected value, language ID EN. It's the same thing we've seen already on the one of the first slides. So this is like proving what is the selected language ID. If no language ID is selected, then it would return English, and that means if it's English, for example, the language ID of the dimension 1 and dimension 2 is filtered on English. So only the English versions are then showing up. If somebody changes the language via the slicer, for example, to German or Danish, then this would be filtered on German or the Danish version of the language ID of those dimensions. And those are influencing the calculation of the sum. So for all the other languages which are currently not selected, the sum of fact sales amount, this measure, is just blank and therefore not shown. So that's the magic behind here. So this is working, but you have to work with treatise. Let's go back to our slides. So treatise, again, very important that you understand this concept. It's called treatise, and treatise can have multiple parameters. So you have one expression and then up to multiple columns which are then forced to equal the result of this expression. So we are creating a relationship on the fly. We also call this as a virtual relationship. So this relationship is not available in the model. Remember, in the model there's no relationship between the language table and the dimension tables, but it's only valid in the DAX statement. Why this is actually working not in the model, causing ambiguity in the model, but works out in DAX, I don't really know. So DAX is obviously more smart. This is smarter than the data model is, because DAX allows us to have those two ways, those two filters applied on the dimensions. Also be aware that creating a virtual relationship means it's not persisted in the model. And if it's not persisted in the model, we lack sort of an index. So if you create a relationship in the model view, this forces Power BI or the Vertipack engine to actually create a sort of an index. So for all of the product keys, there's a list which rows of the fact table are assigned to this product. So this is very fast because it's like already persisted in the model. If we use treatise, there's no such persisted information. There's no index available. So basically, if you're coming from a relational background, Power BI or DAX has then to do a table scan. I mean, it's in memory, it's compressed, but still, it's a table scan. It will take much longer. And in the use case, I mean, the solution I show you currently is one which I implemented for one of my customers. So this is running in production, but for one table, one dimension is really huge. This has over 1 million rows. We are facing performance issues, and we're currently working on tweaking and finding out how we can improve this situation here. So there's a reference to the treatise if you want to look up more about this function. And yeah, so the active relationship will not be like bad on you if you're using virtual relationships, but it will come up with a performance penalty. So always remember that virtual relationships are good for certain cases, but should not be the normal use case. Still build your relationships in the model if you can there. So next thing are the report headlines, basically our formerly static text. But that would be like all the titles we have like on top on the screen or within the visuals. That would be all the buttons, stuff like that. And to do that, of course, we need our language dimension again. And then we have to add a new table containing all those static texts and the display text. So I come up with a table, three columns. One is the language, one is like a technical name, like sales overview without a blank, sales overview, and then the display text, sales blank overview. And then I insert this row not only once, but once per language. So there's another sales overview text component for the German language, which is then Verkaufsübersicht, and one for Danish and one for French, whatever, you name it. And then I pivot this table. So usually, if I have a data warehouse at place, and in the mentioned use case or project, we have a data warehouse in place, so I do all the transformations in a view and don't use very much of Power Query. But for the pivoting of this table, I use Power Query because it's much easier to do instead of writing down the pivot expressions. So what I'm doing there is then using, the only transformation I do in Power Query is then pivot this table. So I get then one column, like instead of having several rows with sales overview, I only have then one column with rows per language. And again, the language is then filtered by the language table, and then I end up with a column named sales overview. And depending on the language, it will return either sales overview or Verkaufsübersicht or whatever the language is I've selected. And then I build this measure or this column. We don't need measures at this place, so I just use this column and move it into the expression-based formatting or expression-based, it's an expression-based text then instead of a static text. For the page names, unfortunately, we cannot translate the page names. They are static. They are really static. So I came up with the solution here. Instead of showing the page names, I show buttons. And I have only one page is visible in my report. That's called Start. So it's like the Windows Start button. And this only shows the buttons referring to the other pages. And the pages themselves, they are hidden. And the people can then click on the fake page navigation, which shows the page names in their native language, in the selected language. And then they can click there and jump over to the report. And for this, I want to introduce the Cognitive Services Translation API, just because it's fun, and I just want to show you how easy it is to ad hoc translate stuff, because for static text it could be like tricky to get the translations for several languages you do not speak, or it's rather complicated to reach out to translators. Then you could like come up with your own text in your native language and then let Cognitive Services come up with all the other languages with the translations into all the other languages. So Cognitive Services is a service in Azure. There's the documentation there, and I think at the beginning of October they moved from 60 languages to over 70 supported languages now. So let's do the next demo and go over to our report here again. And what I'm going to do is that we are changing to Power Query, and I'll show you how we can use Cognitive Service instead of having Excel doing the job here. So this is the text component column table. This looks like that. So we're having, there's a language, it's only 3 columns. And this is the wrong version I want to introduce. I wanted to introduce the first thing, and this is this one. So in Excel or in my base table, this looks like that. So I have 3 columns having the language ID, the text component, and the display text. And the language, currently we only have English as a choice here, so I only came up with English translations of my headers. Then this is the text components. This will later be a column in this table, so we are going to pivot the thing. And this is the English version of this. So sales overview and sales details. Usually I use the English version with as camel case or Pascal case as my future column names. And then I do 2 things. I then appended the text components in a different language. So the Danish version of that is done via Cognitive Services. I will show in a minute how I did this. So I'm appending then the Danish version of sales overview and sales details. So we have Oversicht over Sell and Oplysninger om Sell. This is the Danish version of sales overview and sales details. And at the very end, I pivot this because I do not want to have several rows, but I want to have only several columns and then rows only per language. So we're having now the sales overview. So this is now a column. That's the previous text component. The technical name is now a column, also the sales details. And we have only 1 row per language. Sales overview is the content then for sales overview. And Oplysninger over Sell is then the version. Oversicht over Sell is then the Danish version of sales overview. And what I wanted to demonstrate how we can then translate this to Danish. So you not only learn something about Power BI, but you also learn something about languages, at least some vocabularies in Danish and in German. So I duplicate this, then I will rename this because it will not be another Danish version, but it will be the German version. DE is the language code for Germany. And how is this done? Going over there again. Then we see that this is containing, where's my mouse? My mouse is gone, here's my mouse. So like up there, yeah? So I take the English version of so I filter down to the English version of my text components. This is the original one, only the English rows. Just in case if there would be different languages, I only filter to the English ones, so I only have it in one language. Again, with the technical name in the column text component and the display text in the column display text. And then I invoke a custom function. So the custom function, we can use the gear icon to see the parameters of this custom function. It should come up in a second, the window here. So what I'm doing here is I'm calling a custom function. The only function available in my Power Query currently is called translate API. I call the new column also translate API and I pass over the display text, which is currently only available in English. And I want to translate it not into Danish, but into German. Then I press OK. And then the cognitive services will then come up with the English version, the German version of my columns. So if I go there, after I've expanded and removed all the columns I don't need, then we see like we have again the sales overview, but in the German language. So it's Verkaufsübersicht and Verkaufsdetails. And this is what then I append to my current text component. So text component, I can then append this new query, append queries, and selecting the new text component DE to append to the current query. And I think I made it wrong because I have to make sure that it's done before the pivoting. So sorry, after the appended, I want to append another step here. So I just lost the oversight with zooming into my Power Query. So then I choose the text component DE, the German version of the text components, and append them. So I get them as a new list. So 2 more rows now in my text components for German with Verkaufsübersicht and Verkaufsdetails. And after they are pivoted, we have now 3 rows and 2 columns. So sales overview, the column sales overview is now also available as Verkaufsübersicht in the German language. And this table is then filtered by the language table. So there's a direct relationship between the language table and the text component table, and this guarantees they only get the text component for the selected language. But before we go back to the model, let's take a look how this translation is done. So this is a function I did not come up with totally on my own, but you can get this from the documentation at Microsoft. And basically it's the same script I found there. The only thing I changed is that I used the API key. So they're suggesting directly showing the API key at this space. I prefer not to, because sometimes I have several functions I'm calling, and if the API key changes, because you should change API key on a regular basis, because it's like a password. Somebody knows your API key, then they can use, for example, cognitive services on your costs. So if I change this, I do not want to change all the code, so I have it in the parameter. This is the one reason. The other reason is if I would have it directly there, you could see my API key and then do the cognitive services on my costs. And of course, I would not be happy with that. So that's why I keep this as a secret. But basically, this calls the cognitive services API, and before it can call it, it has to transfer the current text. You can remember that I entered the text and the language. So it's the text I passed in the display text, and language I stated, for example, DE for German. So this text is then transferred or translated into a JSON document, and this JSON document is then sent over to the web content call, and afterwards, so the conversion is done here, JSON content, text binary body. So this is converted into JSON, and afterwards it's translated back into a not non-JSON, just as a text, and that's what the function then returns. So not so complicated. You could also use, if you own Premium, you could also use AI, the built-in AI functionalities of Power BI to do that. So with that now made, I close and apply to return to Power Query. So if I now choose German as a language, as soon as this is refreshed, we also should see the text like the page names and the titles in my queries also in German language. This was not available previously, so if I go to German, Deutsch, come on, let me select the German language. Now it's reacting. Dann wir see Verkaufsübersicht, Verkaufsdetails again in our headers here. In the model, remember, just as a reminder, I have a relationship between the language table and the text component table, so I don't need any DAX or sophisticated things. This is a normal relationship, and as soon as I select the language, the text components only are available in the selected language. So back to slides. By the way, if there are any questions, please ask them. This is a recorded session. That means that I can answer all your questions simultaneously because I pre-recorded this session. I'm watching this session together with you and answering in parallel live your questions. So currencies. How can we convert currencies? So for example, euros, US dollars, Danish crowns, you name it. Because this is also sometimes important that people not only see the reports in their own language, so they fully understand what the report is showing, but also see things in the currency they can relate to. And for that, we need one table containing the currency exchange rates. We could, for example, as a bonus point, come up with a connection to an API, which allows it automatically to download the currency rates. And then you can convert those amounts with different approaches. You could do this in Power Query, you could do it in DAX. What I will show you shortly is the solution in DAX. And as a bonus point, you could come up with a much more complicated solution than mine, because mine is a rather easy one. I just wanted to have this as a checkpoint, as a reminder that you also should think about exchange rates. So a rather easy one where I have a constant exchange rate for all the periods. So the whole model only has one exchange rate between all those currencies, and this is what I'm applying. If you're more interested, check out, for example, DAX patterns from Alberto Ferrari and Marco Russo. That they do a really good job explaining DAX on patterns, so use cases where they introduce what is the problem, how they solve it in DAX, and they have several implementations for several complexities of doing those conversions. And with all the stuff Alberto Ferrari and Marco Russo are showing you, you can always be sure it's the fastest DAX you will get, so performance will not be an issue with the solutions they are presenting. So let's take a look on the demo again on the currency exchange rate. So closing down, but going back to my report, then for example I have a language, not a language, but I have different currency rates, and I can just then show what 2 and 1 means in Brazilian real. So I assume that my 2 and 1 in the fact table is euros, and then I can change this to any other currency available in my model. So how is this done? I have a currency exchange rate table, and maybe I go back to my, I show it here because I already closed down Excel. If you go into the exchange rate, then we can see there's like a list of possible currencies with the exchange rates. So my model assumes that everything is in euros. So if I want to convert to euros, it's just multiplying by 1. And for US dollar, it has to multiply by this, and yen, and so on and so forth. So the spot is the current exchange rate, and I do not distinguish between any exchange rates for the periods available. And then I have one measure here, which shows the selected value. So selected value, again, we already have seen this multiple times in this talk. So selecting then the currency exchange rate spot, that's the exchange rate. If nothing is selected, then I return 1, and this is the measure. And then in my sales measure, for example, with or without the treat as, we already have seen this, I just multiply my whatever I calculated there, I multiply this with the selected currency exchange rate. So that's the whole story here. So back to slides. The model metadata, what I mean with that is that, for example, the table names, the column names, the names of your measures, that they should be able to be translated. So if I connect to the model and state I want to see everything in German, then all the table names, the measure names, and the column names should appear in German. This is done, this is rather easily done because you can export the existing model metadata as a JSON file. Then you can do the translations inside this JSON file and then import it again. One easy way is to use Tabular Editor from Daniel Ottiker. If you've never heard about Tabular Editor, please check it out. It's a really useful tool if you do more advanced stuff in Power BI or in SSIS Tabular. It will tremendously increase your productivity. But be aware that the model metadata you can only change it in analysis services and or Power BI Premium. So Power BI Premium with the XML endpoints available are nothing else than analysis services Tabular. That's why it's also be able there. You cannot use it inside of Power BI Desktop, so you cannot use translations inside of Power BI Desktop. And if you use Power BI Desktop to connect to Premium or analysis services, it also will not allow you to state a language, define a language you want to see the model. So unfortunately, it's not working there. It's not working on Power BI Pro, so if you have model in Power BI Pro, there's no XML endpoint currently available, but Microsoft announced Premium per user, so maybe Premium will be also available soon for you, and it's not available for Power BI Report Server. So what the file looks like, you can export to the JSON file. It's like containing all the metadata, all the names of the rows, everything in your table, and then at somewhere in the middle of your file, there will be a section cultures. And there I introduced the Austrian version of German. DEAT is the Austrian version of German, which is the very same, but I'm Austrian, so I'm using this version. There I can then rename everything. So the original name of my model is model, and then I state here in the translated captions that if somebody connects to the model with this culture, DEAT, it should be Modell, so with double L. Or language should then be Sprache, that's the name of the table, tables, language. And in this table of different columns, for example, language ID should be then translated to Sprache ID. So you would just either do it on your own or forward this file to somebody knowing the original language and the destination language, and then he or she can then translate everything there. Power BI Desktop and Service, of course, we can also customize the languages available there, or like Power BI Desktop or Services represents itself. For Power BI Desktop in the standalone version, so the one which you download and install with the MSI or exe file, you go to Options, Global and Regional Settings. In the Power BI Desktop version of which you downloaded via the Windows Store, you have to change the language in your Windows settings. So Windows settings, time, language, and region and language. In Power BI Service, there's the settings options, and there in general you can then also change the language the Power BI Service appears to you. And on Power BI Report Server, if you're using that, so that's like a local version of Power BI which you run on your own managed hardware or infrastructure, you have to change the settings for the internet browser, because it's reading out what the language settings are there. There's also a cool blog post out there explaining what to change for this to get the right display language. There's no demo for that available. But I want to show you two alternatives. So if you think like having this bridge table in the model, or having like this treat as in the DAX measures, you do not like that because it's too complicated, then think about two alternatives. So one alternative I came up with is misusing row level security. So row level security, if you think about it, is nothing more than a user is assigned to a role, and if you assign to a role, then there are filters applied automatically, which you cannot change. They are just there. And what I thought about it, what if I came up with the role to filter the language ID of all the tables containing a language ID? So then I don't need the treat as. So either I use the username, or if you're using Power BI embedded, then embedded sends over everything over custom data. Then custom data could contain the language, or a combination of a user and language and something else. Or you could use the user culture function, which shows then, for example, DEAT, like the language from the user. In Power BI Desktop, that means that if you start the report, you have to go to Modeling, View As, and then select the role containing the logic for the languages, and then pass in the language you want to see that. In Power BI Service, this role is automatically assigned, so the user would not be able to change the language, but I could pre-select a language per user. But be aware, those role settings in the service only apply to normal users. If you're a workspace admin, the role settings, you can assign a user to a role, but if he or she is a workspace admin, this will not work for them. So they will oversee all the languages, like in the first demo when we saw chair, stol, and Stuhl. So 3 red bars, 3 blue bars. This was because the language was not filtered, and this would happen to all the workspace admins. So how does this look like? If we go to the report here and applying role level security, I tried different versions of that, and I will demonstrate. I think we have time for one. So in the modeling view, so currently I don't have anything selected. And for example, there's Fritz and James and Jens, and Fritz is the German guy, and James is the English speaking guy, and Jens is the Danish speaking guy. And I can then go to modeling and view as, and then could select that I want to filter, was it by username? I think let's take the language here. So I want use the role named English language, and then I assign that I only want to see everything in English, for example. So if I press OK now, if this works, then we should see in a second that now we only see everything in English instead of German. So this is working here. It's filtering on English. There's still something here with Deutsch and English. I think I have to change this to English as well. So now it should work. And if I change the language here, view as, to change this, for example, to DR for the Danish version, then everything here should be in Danish. So the filtering is not done on the text, but only working on my actual data. So how is this done? I came up with, as mentioned, with different versions of that, but this is like a role. The role is called language, and the role filters now my dimensions. So the dimension is then filtered by whatever the content of username is. So in this case, I have to type in EN or DA or DE as my username. If I use Power BI embedded, then custom data could contain, for example, their language. And I'm doing this for all my dimensions. So this is how I'm filtering then the dimensions without having the treat as in Power BI in my measures. So this is one version. But yeah, allows you for not doing the 3ds, but introducing, it's a different workaround with different backdrafts, I would say. And the other workaround I came up with was, I'm explaining here what's happening here, what the username is, depending on if you're in Power BI Desktop, then it would be like the domain name and the username. If you're in Power BI Service, it would be more or less your email address. That's how you authenticate against the Power BI service. And then in Power BI Desktop, we could choose this over modeling view. In Power BI Service, it would be automatically set. In the Power BI Embedded, you would use custom data to fill, for example, the language. User culture would also work. So this contains, for example, EN-US if your user culture is English, American English. And you could also filter like that. So instead of having the language ID should equal the username or custom data, you could then state the language ID should be left of user culture 2. That means we get the first two characters of the user culture, and this would be the language you're looking for. The second alternative to avoid the treat as would be to sync the slicers. This is what I think a well hidden feature. So if you ask me, not many people know about that feature. So a synced filter means that we have one filter per language ID. So we have language ID currently for the language table in dimension 1 and dimension 2. And then I would introduce a filter, 3 filters for all of those 3. Then I can group those filters and sync them with each other. So even if they are on the same page, for example, I can group them and announce that I want them to be synced across against them all. And of course, I do not want to drive the users crazy by showing them several filters on the language. I only would show one and hide the other ones. So then we don't need treat as, which we have per dimensions. So it's easy on that part. But remember that we don't have this logic then in the model. So the model doesn't filter on the languages, and the DAX measures are not filtering. We are depending on that in every report connected to the model, the slices are synced. So if you're connecting with another Power BI report to the same model, then you also have to implement the sync slicer architecture for one. And second, if you connect with a different tool like Excel, where it's not possible to sync slices, at least I'm not aware of a feature like that, it would not work. And those people would then say again, see several, all the dimensions in all languages, like chair, stool, and the numbers are summing up. So there's a little bit of danger there. And backdraft also here is that the slicer is then on the ID. So we have to filter not on a readable display text like English, Danish, or German, but on the actual ID. So like EN, DE, DA. Either your user is okay with that, or you actually to use the long version of the name as the ID. So write English, Dansk, or German, or Deutsch as the ID of your languages into the dimensions. Yeah, I already mentioned that we have to implement this in every single Power BI report. So let's have a demo on this last thing before running out of time. So this is done here with the sync slicers. So on this page, we will see that there is not only one language ID filter, but there are several language ID filters. So for some reason, I still have the row level security feature in place. So there's 3 slicers, and one is, if you take a look there, one is on the language ID. The other one is on the language ID of table dimension 1. And the third one is on dimension 2. And I synced them. So we can, in view, sync slicers. You're probably aware of that feature, but there's also well hidden in the advanced options. There's a possibility that I group those filters. So I grouped all of them. I stated they belong to one common group, which I just named language. It could be any name. And then I checked this box here, sync field changes to other slices. So for all of the slices belonging to the same group, they will be in sync. So that means if I change one to a different one, for example, DE for Deutsch, then all the others will change, and that's why this report will work again. Remember, like in the other version, this one is depending on sales, no treat as. So there's no treat as in place. This is working with all your measures, but you have to sync your slices for that. So 1 minute to go. So I need to wrap it up. So think about, unfortunately, there's not one-stop shop for all those settings. So changing the languages, localizing reports is not a feature of Power BI. We have to do workarounds. And of course, workarounds introduce other issues where you can then again find workarounds. And you can learn something about the product, but it's a more complicated solution. The decimal separator cannot be changed by your settings. It's automatically done from the operating system or the browser. And the expression-based formatting, which I use for all the titles and so on, they are not supported everywhere. The product team implements them at more places over and over, but still they're not available at all the places. So call to actions. please try to find out what solutions, either parts of what I presented or those mentioned at the beginning of the talk, maybe there's something for you available what you're looking for, and use the least bad one. So unfortunately there's not a really brilliant solution if you ask me, but there's several workarounds. If you're really looking for a solution that they build into the product, please make sure to vote for those ideas. So currently there's just a bunch of votes there. We need at least 1,000 votes or more that we get these ideas on the product backlog for the product team. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be around for about 15 minutes for answering your questions you might have. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference.